Welcome to the Dublin Bible Talks, midweek Bible talks for workers in Dublin. I'm Cameron Jones. When you're looking for a leader, sometimes what you see in someone is just so impressive that you can't imagine why everyone else doesn't see things the same way. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, we find that God sees differently to how we see. And please consider joining us live on Wednesdays from your workplace, 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom. It's a simple way of identifying as a Christian in your workplace. Simply use the link bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. We've been looking at 1 Samuel and seeing that the theme of this book is leadership, particularly leadership of God's people. What do you look for in a leader? People always have different points of view, don't they? Especially when it comes to leadership, and you might see something in a leader that makes you think that they are the one. The choice seems so clear that you cannot imagine how anyone would vote for anyone else. But of course, other people see things differently. Now, can it be that all we have in making decisions about leadership in general, can it really be that all we have is opinion? That all we have is preferences, not really having any right or wrong, no true or false, just different points of view? As we consider this, consider people's opinions about Jesus. One view of Jesus is that he is the almighty ruler of the universe, the saviour that all people need, and the judge of all. And every other view about Jesus is unified by denying that previous point of view. And then in Western culture, we largely have an insistence that it's wrong to say anything really definitive about Jesus, as if Jesus was really defined by our point of view of him. You believe what you want, that's fine, but just keep it to yourself. Keep this idea of points of view in mind as we turn to 1 Samuel 16, back to a time where Israel had asked for a king. And we'd been looking at the story of Saul, whose name means asked for. He was the king Israel wanted, the one who would make them like the other nations. He was a man who literally stood head and shoulders above everyone else, an impressive leader by any number of measures. Have you heard, friends, of this thing called the Presidential Height Index? It's a theory that says that the taller candidate in US presidential elections usually is the one who wins. Or maybe you've heard of people talk about having CEO hair. That C-level leaders tend to have thick, lustrous hair. Too bad for me. Or that female senior leaders are disproportionately blonde. Had you come across that? Maybe our own age is not very different to 1,000 years before Christ in making decisions based upon superficial things, the things that we see. Well, Saul, the asked-for king, seems to have been very successful in ways that the nations would count success. In chapter 11, verses 1 to 11, we saw that he rallied the people who'd been divided and dispersed and brought them together to act as one unified nation. In chapter 11:15, we saw him providing a level of political stability that had been absent from the land. In chapter 14, we read of his military success. We might see that from a worldly point of view, he is a successful king. But the Bible sees things differently because Saul disobeyed God. In 1 Samuel 13 and 1 Samuel 15, and we have seen that made him a disaster as a leader for God's chosen people. How can God's people be led by a man who refuses to obey God? A stark contrast is Jesus, of course, 1,000 years after, who prayed to his Father, "Not my will, but yours." Well, in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, we see the key to the problem of points of view. In verses 1 to 3, we see a rejected king. In verses 4 to 10, we have two ways of seeing. And in verses 11 to 13, we have the king who God sees. So in verses 1 to 3, we have a rejected king, and some time has passed since the end of chapter 15. It concluded with Samuel mourning Saul, who has been rejected by God. And we start in verse 1, the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I've rejected him as king over Israel?" On this day the Lord rebukes Samuel, for the time of mourning is past. How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Rejection. Rejection has been a theme throughout the account of Saul. If you think back to chapter 8, when the people first asked for a king, the Lord said to Samuel, "It's not you they have rejected me as their king." Rejection. In chapter 10, Samuel told the people that this is exactly what they had done. In verse 19, he had said, "Today you have rejected your God who saves you from all your calamities and distresses." Just in the last chapter, chapter 15, Samuel addressed Saul, the asked-for king, saying, "You have rejected the word of God." And the result in the next verse is that the Lord has rejected you, Saul, from being king over Israel. Rejection has run through these last chapters. And at the beginning of chapter 16, Samuel is called by God to recognize God's judgment is right and it is final, but that the story for Israel is not finished. Samuel is to turn from grief to God's vision for the future. "Fill your horn with oil," the second half of verse 1, "and go, I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." Now, this translation gets the idea right, but in this chapter we're going to find that it's very helpful to know that the idea of choosing is often expressed in the original language using the language of seeing. It's quite logical, really, isn't it? Just imagine you've got some work to do around your house and you've got your toolbox. How do you choose the right tool for the job? Well, you look into your toolbox and you see the one you want and you reach your hand in to get the one you've seen. Your seeing the tool was your choosing of it. The way the Lord instructs Samuel goes something like this: "I have seen among his sons for myself someone a king." And this is important in this chapter because this chapter is about the way that God sees things, and also that God sees differently to how we humans see things. And so God's choices are different to our choices. There's something else important going on in that short sentence. Listen again to what God says. He says, "I have seen among his sons for myself a king." Now that is a stark contrast to Saul and his choice as king. Saul was a king that the people had chosen for themselves. In chapter 8, verse 5, they asked Samuel, "Appoint for us a king." In that same chapter, in verse 18, the people are told explicitly that Saul is your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. Verse 22 of chapter 8, the Lord said, "I will make a king for them." In chapter 12, verse 19, the people acknowledged this, saying that they have asked for a king for ourselves. And while God remains sovereign over their choice, the emphasis throughout Saul's kingship is fundamentally on the people's demand of a king for themselves. But while all that was happening, God's already revealed something about his own plans. In chapter 13, verse 14, you'll remember that God announced, "The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart to be prince over his people." And now here in chapter 16, the time has come for the Lord to choose, to see for himself, for his own purposes, a king. not the asked-for king, but the one seen by God. But there's a problem. Verse 2, Samuel said, "How can I go? Saul will hear about it and kill me, because Saul's still on the throne, isn't he?" Samuel realized that he has to pass through Saul's home country to get to where God has told him to go, to Bethlehem. It's a dangerous thing to do, that. I mean, if you're going to appoint someone else king when there's already a king on the throne, that might be seen as a bit of a problem for the king who's on the throne. It might be seen as traitorous. But these fears are not to stop Samuel, so God gives him some more details about his visit. The Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I've come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You're to anoint, you are to Messiah, for me, the one I indicate." And Samuel does what Saul has failed to do. Samuel obeys the Lord. Verse 4, Samuel did what the Lord said. It seems that it's not just Samuel who's nervous about going to Bethlehem. Look at how he's received in Bethlehem. When he arrived in Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, "Do you come in peace?" They know that there's been a falling out between Saul and Samuel. But Samuel replies, "Yes, in peace, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. Friends, this is a build-up to one of the most important points in history. But of course, even if you'd been there that day, it wouldn't have looked very impressive. It really is coming to a great turning point in global history, but its unimpressiveness in appearance is a part of the point that we are supposed to notice. See, God chooses things in a way that we don't choose. God takes special interest in Jesse's family, and we learn more about seeing things properly. It's important to see things from God's point of view, is what we're learning. When Jesse's family come, in verse 6, Samuel looks on Eliab, the eldest son, and he thinks immediately, "The Lord's anointed is before him." Notice the language of vision again. Samuel looks on the oldest son, Eliab. He sees an impressive man, a man that anyone would see and say, "Surely this is the one that God has chosen to be his anointed." But look at verse 7. The Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him." See, Samuel is seeing in the same way as you or I would see this man. Samuel is seeing Eliab as the nation had seen Saul. He'd looking at his appearance, his height, and Eliab is similar to Saul in those attributes, and is similar to Saul in that God has rejected him. The kind of thing that the nations, that normal people alienated from God, people like you and me, look for in a leader, God does not choose according to those things. Eliab, like Saul, is rejected by God as king material. Now listen, friends, and see for yourselves this key verse in the second half of verse 7. "For the Lord sees not as man sees." Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. There we have God's point of view described. See, God's view is not limited like ours is. No, he sees the heart of a person. Oh, yes, that is true, but actually I don't think that's the point of this passage. I'm sorry to do this to you. I don't want to damage your faith in the translation we have. It really is a very good translation, and it gets the word across very well to us. But just listen to a slightly more literal version of this verse. "For the Lord sees not as man sees, for man sees according to the eyes of him, but the Lord sees according to the heart of him." Do you see the difference in the way that paints the picture of what's happening? Who is the him in those statements? The eyes of him, the heart of him. The of him is the one who's doing the seeing, the one who's doing the choosing. You see, we choose according to what we see. We choose according to our eyes. But God sees, God chooses using God's heart. It's like we say we've set our heart upon something. We desire that thing. Our will is that we should have that thing that we have set our heart upon. And here we learn that is the way that God sees people before him. The candidates for leadership for God's people is not made by external appearances, but according to God's heart, according to God's will, the one God puts his heart upon. Eliab, as tall, as impressive as he looks, is not the one God wills to be his king, and so he is rejected. God is looking for the one he has set his heart upon, the one he has chosen according to his will. Now, I've spent a bit of time on this because it's really important in understanding the rest of 1 Samuel, in understanding the rest of 2 Samuel, in terms of understanding the rest of history. It helps us understand, chapter 16, verse 1, that the Lord has seen for himself a king among Jesse's sons. It's the same language that had been used back in chapter 13, using the same words. The Lord has sought for himself a man according to his own heart. It is not that the person God chooses for himself as king is a particularly godly man, as if the heart of the person is particularly impressive or godly or special. No, God chooses this king because it is God's will to choose that king. Look at the emphasis of this in verse 8 and 9 and 10. Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass before Samuel. But Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." Jesse then came to Shammah, and Samuel said, "Nor has the Lord chosen this one." And Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these. The Lord has not chosen. He is not looking for them to be his king." This is about the choice of God's heart, the choice of God's will, God's election. In Abraham, God chose Israel to be his people. And now we are about to see God choose for himself a king. And the security of this king's throne is not going to rest on the people's choice or even the king's performance, but on the choice and the promise of God. And this is what will make the reign of the king God chooses by his own heart very different to the asked for king, Saul. Very different. Well, let's look at the king that God sees, verses 11 to 13. First of all, we find out that this is a very unlikely looking king. Verse 11, so he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There's still the youngest," Jesse answered, "but he's tending the sheep," as if to say, "We didn't think you'd want to see him. I mean, he's just a kid." But Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent and had him brought in. He was ruddy, with a fine appearance and handsome features. In a chapter where seeing and appearance has such prominence, we meet a young boy who is red in complexion, or it could be referring to his hair. Beautiful eyes, good looks, and that's probably recorded with a little bit of irony. Note here that we're not told of his height. Note we're told nothing of his stature, like we were his older brother, like we were with the king asked for, Saul. No, we might have a good-looking young boy, but no one sees this guy as king material. Verse 12, the second half, the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. He's the one." But this young boy, this one that no one else paid any attention to, this is the one who be Messiahed, to be anointed. Why? Because the Lord has set his heart upon him. So, verse 13, Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. Samuel then went to Ramah. The Spirit, the breath of God, rushes on this young boy. And we must remember that the Spirit of God is God himself. The Spirit accomplishes God's purposes in creation. The Spirit accomplishes God's purposes for his people. And in particular, in the history of Israel, God's Spirit equips God's leader. God's Spirit equips the leader of God's people. The effect of the Spirit on these leaders is different. In Judges, the Spirit falls on Samson and enables him to tear a lion to pieces. And another time falls on Samson again, and he strikes down 30 of God's enemies by himself. You'll remember that the Spirit had fallen on Saul, and Saul had prophesied, and had developed a real righteous anger, and had raised an army in defense of God's people. The Spirit of God came upon God's leader to do what was required in the situation. And then, at every point up to this, after that purpose is completed, the Spirit of God is not upon them. And so notice the significance of the additional words that are found in verse 13, from that day forward. The Spirit does not come on David only for a particular task, but this one that God has chosen for himself is the one upon whom God's Spirit remains. This one is going to be a very different king, the king God has seen for himself. And we hear for the first time God's chosen king's name, David, a name that means beloved, the man upon whom God has set his heart. And this man is empowered by God for the task that lies ahead of him, empowered by the very Spirit of God who remains on him. But of course we know, don't we, that this king, even this king upon whom God has set his heart, does not end up doing all we need and hope for. No, even this King David is a shadow of what God will one day do through a greater king. In this beloved King David, chosen by God for himself, we'll receive some instruction as to how God works. And in seeing that, we will be able to recognize the king who will be a prophet like Moses, but better, who will be like one of the priests, but better, who will be like David, according to God's own choosing, but even better than beloved David. And God does this so that when great David's greater son arrives, we would recognize him. And recognize that his significance is not based upon our point of view. It's not about our choice of king, but upon God's choice of king. So around about 1,050 years later, we hear that a man comes to be baptized. And that the baptizer, as he's baptizing this man, sees the Spirit come down on him and remain on him. John chapter 1, verse 32. And so we are reminded of the king that God chooses. And when we read of other people's memories of that same baptism, they heard a voice from heaven saying, "This is my son whom I have chosen, listen to him." Luke 9:35. And we're reminded that this is how God works to establish a king for himself, not a king we might choose, not according to the things we might think will make a person impressive as a leader. Friends, you might be impressed by any number of things in this world. You might be impressed by the teachings of Gautama, the Buddha, compelling and attractive. You might find something that appeals, something that clicks with us. Or you might find the Quran and the idea of Islam, submission to God by the teachings of Muhammad. You might find that attractive. It might seem good to your eyes. They might appear to give order and structure in a world full of immoral chaos. Or you might be struck by the serenity and strength of the Dalai Lama, inspired by a combination of a passive struggle, a personal spirituality and self-denial, by the fluttering of prayers carried to the spirits of the mountains. That might appeal to you. We might even be convinced that this person or that party is the means by which peace is going to be achieved and order is given and justice provided and freedom and security realised. But God teaches us in this part of his word that what we are impressed with is limited by our view, because we see only according to our eyes. The life and the failure of King Saul teaches us again and again about the kind of leaders that we choose and keep on choosing for ourselves. And as we see our own leaders that we choose, as impressive as they might have originally appeared, fail and fail and fail again, just as our own attempts individually, even or by the leader that we choose, to reach out to God, to have a relationship with him, and they fail and they fail and they fail. We need a leader of God's own choosing, and that is who Jesus is. We choose according to what we can see. What we need is someone who is chosen by God's perfect will. And it matters not one bit whether we look at God's chosen king and we find his life rather unimpressive or unattractive, that we find the means of his birth in a backwater town of Bethlehem unimpressive, that we find his teaching offensive, that we find his death pathetic. Do you think that matters? And that is Jesus, God's anointed, God's chosen king. He is God's choice, the one that God has seen fit to appoint as king and as judge. Acts 17:31. And whatever our point of view about God's choice, that does not make one bit of difference to God. For God has chosen for himself a king after his own heart. So the question ends up being whether or not we let our own limited point of view, our way of seeing with our own eyes, be the way that guides our decisions about eternal things, or whether we will submit ourselves to God's way of thinking, and so take Jesus as the only king, as the only one who is worth following. That is the only point about Jesus that really matters. Thank you for listening to the recording of the Dublin Bible Talks. You can join us in real time on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom, bit.ly/Dublin Bible Talks. That's bit.ly/Dublin Bible Talks.